We'll cover more than this, by the way. We also will get to the text that's commonly called the Garden of Gethsemane, so we'll be taking a little more, but this initially is the text we're looking at. It's been 2.5 months, have you noticed? So I thought it might be useful just to quickly recreate the context. Mark divides neatly right down the middle. Caesarea Philippi is that dividing point. The whole gospel, most commentators, decent commentators, concur, is a celebration, a description of the authority of Christ, but there's a difference between the first half and the last half. In the first half, you might say the authority is what could be called charismatic authority. It's the authority that Jesus has by dint of his person, but there's nobody in the story itself, nobody in the script who actually ties an office to that authority. It's just the authority that he has when he shows up. What he says, what he does, how he acts, his personal presence has this kind of commanding, awe-inspiring effect on those who are there. It's almost as if God were here among us, you know? They just don't know what to do with it, but there's something rather just over the top about this. But now at Caesarea Philippi, the veil is pulled back. We find out the authority that we're dealing with does have an office. And really the last half, you might say, is the bureaucratic authority of Christ. The charismatic authority, the bureaucratic authority. He has a bureau. He has an office. He has a position. And that position is Messiah. Peter says you're the Messiah, the Christos, the christened one, the anointed one, the Messiah, prophet, priest, and both of those joined together in the consummate expression of Messiahship that he's the king. Now, if Jesus is a king, it immediately suggests there must be a kingdom. And so the character is, what kind of kingdom is it over which this Messiah rules? And the rest of Mark, this last half of Mark, is really painting a picture of the king and the kingdom. And especially the kingdom is described for us. The character of the kingdom. We thought kingdoms were places with pomp and circumstance, white horses pulling golden carriages, and people in nice clothes impressing each other with how much prestige they had. And Jesus says, no, not exactly. The one who wants to be great in this kingdom must become servant of all. You must become more preoccupied with the least of these. Your position in the kingdom is not conditioned by the external trappings of greatness, but by the true, deep determination to serve Christ, even if it's in humility, even if it's unseen, even if it's in the back room where nobody knows about it. Nevertheless, that's the true nature of this kingdom. The crisis of the kingdom unfolds when Jesus shows up in Jerusalem. Here's the king confronting the old order. And he reaches a judicial opinion of judgment. The verdict is guilty. The kingdom thus is taken from you and given to those worthy of it. Your house is left to you desolate. Not one stone will be left on another. Those are judgment words pronounced by this king against the old order. At the same time, there's the opportunity to come with Jesus into the new. The choice is there for anybody. But the old order is going down. Some will come with Jesus, some won't. Some will believe, some will persecute and try to destroy Christ and his followers. And then finally we have what I'm calling the creation of the kingdom. The kingdom is a constitutional kingdom. Some kingdoms are created in totalitarian ways. A person with a big stick just beats you into submission. Not Jesus. This kingdom in the Old Testament, as well as in the New, is based on a constitution called the New Covenant. And so what is happening now in this creation of the kingdom is the New Covenant is being inaugurated. And thus all of the stories here have something to do with this covenant. We see, first of all, the covenant anticipated. Jesus is anointed by this unnamed woman. Otherwise, we know her to be Mary. For his burial. You see, his death and burial are the very heart of what creates this new covenant. Then we have the covenant solemnized, a ceremony The Passover that we just looked at last week, in which Jesus says, "This is my body broken for you, take it and eat it. This is the blood of the covenant in this cup." And so we have a kind of solemnizing of the new covenant. Then we have the section we're just now beginning, the arrest and trial of Jesus. I'm calling this the covenant acknowledged, because the irony is that throughout this section, we'll really get into this more next week, we find that the prosecutors of Jesus, the judges of Jesus, the jury, the executioner, all of them will at some point or other say, "You are the Christ." They will acknowledge out of their own mouths, and Jesus will simply affirm what they said. It's a very odd and ironic thing that it's the enemies of Jesus that actually acknowledge his true identity in his trial. Then we have the covenant ratified. In the old world, covenants were not written and signed, they were cut. So you'll hear of a covenant cutting ceremony. The cutting of Jesus, when he's put on the cross, when his body is broken, that's a covenant cutting moment that ratifies this new covenant. And then finally we have the covenant vindicated in the resurrection. An angel says to the women, "He's not here, he's risen." And everything we ever suspected of Jesus and everything he ever said is proven to be true, you see, by this moment in which he rises from the dead. Well, we're right in the middle section, the arrest and trial of Jesus. We're going to see that every little piece of this highlights fundamentally the Messiah is alone. And it begins when he says, "You're all going to leave me alone." The loneliness of Christ is essential to the gospel. He didn't pull off the atonement with help from anybody. There wasn't anyone there supporting him and helping him and bearing him up along the way. And that's a theological point, because any theology that comes along and says that we somehow supplement the work of Christ, we bring a little of our own merit to fill in anything lacking in his work, misses by miles the point of the gospel, that he did it on his own. When Martin Luther said we're justified by faith alone, he was saying we're justified by Christ alone, not Christ plus some contribution that I make to sort of fill in the gaps there. And so he has to be alone at this. This is why they had to abandon him. It sounds like a little bit of a criticism of them, but in a sense what Jesus says is it has to be this way. You're all going to be made to stumble for me this night, because it is written, "I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." All of you have to leave me. All of you will be made to stumble. I've been practicing all week to say this word, and I'm still not sure I can get it. These multisyllabic words, you know. Scandalisthesista. Scandalisthesista. Who would make up a word like that? I don't know, but there it was right in the text. So that's my one top shot at it. You recognize the root of the word is the word scandal. You will all be scandalized because of me this night. The commentator Moffat says, to be disconcerted, implying being split apart by a sudden and unexpected attack. Faith can be caught by surprise. You know, you're going along fine, everything seems that your faith is intact, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, something unexpected, and you're just caught unawares, and you behave in a sub-Christian fashion because your faith was caught off guard. You ever had that happen to you, or is it just me? I don't know, but this is what happened to these guys. They felt stalwart, they felt brave, they felt like they had everything that they needed, and yet at the same time, they were going to be caught off guard. The King James translated this, "You'll be offended." One old commentator said, "There's much in following Jesus that gives offense. To walk in step with Jesus is always to walk out of step with the crowd. And if you don't believe it, just go into the public square and say something on behalf of Jesus and see how quickly you're demonized, in the press and in the public eye." These words might have sounded like a kind of cynical sneer on the part of Christ. You can't imagine Julius Caesar ever saying such a thing to his troops as they marched into Gaul. But actually, when Jesus says this, it's not cynicism, it's a loving warning intended on the one hand to deflate their swollen pride, and at the other hand to establish the principle, Jesus must walk this path alone. And so the Old Testament says, I, God, will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. And they were. But soon enough they regathered. Even on the day of the resurrection, Jesus found them in that same upper room where they had celebrated the Last Supper just 2 days earlier. Jesus shows up in their midst, and he says to them, I will meet you in Galilee later. So after I finish the work that only I can do, we'll find ourselves back in more familiar surroundings, and there Jesus would commission them to just go and change the world. And in fact, that's exactly what they did. Well, Peter, of course, will have none of it. Even if all are made to stumble, I will not be made to stumble. Peter is probably the source of this report. He tends to be self-effacing in Mark's view of the gospel because Peter was probably a primary source to Mark in writing this. And so Peter tends not to be very heroic for the most part in the gospel of Mark. And here we have this kind of bravado that shows up. As Mark says, even if all these other flakes, abandon you, you can count on me. I'm your guy. You don't have to worry about that. It's a precarious position to regard oneself as any sort of exception to the rule, and that, of course, is what Peter claims to be. I don't know about you. I've caught myself occasionally looking at somebody in an unhappy situation of life, and they got there by bad choices they've made, bad decisions along the way. And do you ever play the little tape in your mind that says, I could never do that? Don't you believe it? We're much better off to say with D.L. Moody, there but for the grace of God go I, than to say I could never do that. Because the things that other people do are things we are all perfectly capable of, but for grace. Peter could never imagine that he would do what Jesus is predicting, and yet it was only 2 or 3 hours later when he would call down curses on his head, saying he didn't even know Jesus and didn't know what that little girl was talking about. Can you imagine that? In just a couple of hours. Jesus says to him, assuredly I say to you today, even this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. Amen, I say to you, is the formula here, the 14th and final time we have that particular phrasing in Mark's gospel. The timing would be about 2 a.m. when the rooster might crow twice. That would be probably when Jesus was in his first so-called trial in the home of Caiaphas. He hadn't made it to Pilate yet by this time. Peter would have been warming himself in the outer court by the fire. That's about when the time frame would dictate these things happened. You will deny me. The word means to disown, to deny any connection whatsoever, and in the Greek structure of the sentence, the word deny is made emphatic. You will deny me in a big way, is really the sense of what Jesus says. But he spoke more vehemently, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you, and they all said the same thing. The ancient commentator Hilary says, quote, Peter was so carried away by the fervor of his zeal and love for Christ that he regarded neither the weakness of his own flesh nor the truth of his master's words. This brings us to a text that I have to say fills me with dread to presume to try to teach it, and I want to just say at the outset, we all stand a stone's throw away and look at one of the most profound mysteries described for us in all of the Gospels. This is something the church would never have made up. The truth of what happens here. When the Christ who has always been sufficient, always had the right thing to say, always been the one you can rely on, now has what appears to be a complete meltdown before our eyes. We realize that what we're seeing here is the very truth of what happened. And the disciples would have no agenda supporting presenting their Christ in this way, except that it actually was the way it was. I don't know that I can presume to explain, and I won't even try, the mystery of the heart of this drama that plays out within the very Trinity itself, Father and Son, in this. How can we wrap our minds around it? I don't know, but we're given a hint of something of it in these words. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here, keep awake." And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." We have the Messiah alone, and now we have the Messiah agonizing. In this lonely moment of agony, the road is beginning. They came to a place called Gethsemane, and he told his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." Gethsemane is called a garden. It was really more of an orchard of olive trees. The word Gethsemane means an olive press, which was probably part of the operation. Josephus tells us that surrounding Jerusalem there were actually quite a few of these in the suburbs of Jerusalem, but this was probably the one that was best known because it was on the road to the Mount of Olives. Jesus says to his disciples, all of those who were with him, "Stay here. I have to pray." Emphasis, alone. One commentator took the opportunity to point out that we all have lonely moments when the dearest friends, the closest relatives, really can't join in. We have to do it on our own. He said, quote, "In the critical moral choices, in great personal risks, in looming disaster, we go it alone, learning God will be closer than any other could be." I've always loved the quote from Corrie ten Boom. I've mentioned it before. You'll never know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have, you know. And she learned that in a concentration camp under the Nazis. We think we need a lot of stuff, but when it comes down to the lonely, agonizing moments of life, we may discover all we need is Jesus. But now it's Jesus himself who's learning that he has to go this alone, and the only one who can help him is the one who is, in a sense, going to turn his back on him. Another commentator said, Jesus here is the ideal martyr. He goes to his death with soul prepared, his loins girt for the struggle, the athlete of God, utterly obedient to the Father's will, wholly consecrated for this ordeal. He continues, once more, we can easily imagine what all this means to Mark's readers in the persecuted Roman church, as Mark presumably is writing to folks who are facing horrific prospects of persecution and death at the hands of the madman Nero. They gained some kind of encouragement, I'm sure, from this account of Jesus himself. Well, Jesus from there takes the inner three, Peter and James and John, and began to be troubled and deeply distressed. Peter, James, and John, the inner three, who had been with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, seen his glory. Probably it was calculated to give them courage now that they see the Messiah in his agony. We don't know whether they remembered that. The evidence is not very clear, but at least they had that experience somewhere in their minds as they went through this. Mark tells us Jesus became troubled and deeply distressed. Highly inadequate renderings of these rich Greek terms. The first one, ekthambasthai, used only by Mark in the New Testament, used 3 times by Mark. Once before, once later than this incident. The earlier time was in Mark chapter 9 when Jesus came down from the Mount of Transfiguration and the crowds looked at him and were struck with awe. Maybe it was the residual effects of the Transfiguration. Hard to say, but there was a moment that it just seems they were rendered paralyzed and speechless by the sight of Christ coming from that place. The other time Mark uses is describing the women who went to the tomb on Easter morning and encountered an angel who said, "He is not here, he is risen," and they were struck with awe, speechless, paralyzed. Both of those incidents describe people reacting in some sense to Jesus. The middle one before us now is the one in which Jesus himself is reacting to the prospect of what lies before him. The other word Mark uses is atonement. This has the idea of being in extreme distress, weighty, misery, a horrific and oppressive kind of darkness is implied in both words. What is going on? The whole description leaves us, if we just look at it with fresh eyes, somewhat perplexed. The crusty old commentator of the 19th century, John Trapp, said, "Now it was that he took that terrible cup at his Father's hands and drunk it off all at once, which we must else have been sipping and sucking at throughout all eternity." We have this sense that what Jesus is about to endure in finite time, in a few hours on the cross, would have taken us precisely eternity to satisfy with respect to our infractions of God's righteousness. Something of that seems to be in the mind of Christ as he looks forward to the next events. Jesus said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch." The word that is rendered exceedingly sorrowful is the Greek word perilupos. The prefix peri, means around, like a perimeter. Lupos means grief. The picture that comes to mind is to be besieged, surrounded on every side by anguish and grief. Have you ever felt that way? That no matter which direction you look, it's grief and anguish that are coming at you, besieged by it. That's the word that is in mind here. Jesus says it's so severe, this to his disciples, that it could even drive him to death. Luke tells us he sweat great drops of blood. You know that. A physiological possibility under the most extraordinary and extreme kind of pressure. Jesus has been criticized for having such a trauma in the face of torture and death. He lived in the Greco-Roman world, a fusion of the Greeks and the Romans. Both the Greeks and the Romans viewed death with a certain degree of disdain. At least that was what they held up as the ideal. The great hero of the Greek tradition, Socrates, is sitting there, the Phaedo dialogue, comforting his disciples who are weeping at the thought of losing the great philosopher, and he's in a state of repose, he's serene, he's unconcerned, he's about to drink the hemlock. That's no particularly pleasant way to go, by the way, drinking hemlock. He knew it, but nevertheless, he has a kind of serenity about him. You think about the Romans, they celebrated stoic kind of what was called ataraxia to the Stoic philosophers, a sort of detachment, a kind of equilibrium. They viewed life and death in a kind of detached way. Okay, if you live, it's fine. If you die, it's fine. It's okay. If you go through hard times, it's because it was all determined by the fates, and what can you do anyway except keep your emotions under control? If they were looking for a heroic example in the Greco-Roman world, they look at the wrong place when you take a look at the Garden of Gethsemane, because Jesus is anything but the ideal of the Greeks or the Romans. Why is that? The church would never have invented it, and we have to ask ourselves, what was it that is now in the mind's eye of Jesus that drives him to the kind of extremities in which Mark himself is groping for the right language to properly explain to us what's going on. The most straightforward answer is that the death Jesus was about to die was not simply the death of an unfortunate martyr. It wasn't the torturing of someone who shouldn't have gone through such a thing. But something vastly greater was happening. I've appreciated Mel Gibson's treatments of the Messiah, the Passion of the Christ, and the only little criticism I'd render is that he focuses so much on the physical torture, which was certainly true, and he depicts it reasonably accurately. And yet that wasn't the worst part of it. But how do you picture the worst part of it? It's an unseen reality that is in fact vastly in excess of any physical trauma that Jesus went through, as bad as that was. Because what he's going through is what's called an atoning death. Candy and I were in Seattle some time back and went to Bethany Presbyterian Church, PCUSA Church over in Seattle, attended by our kids who live over there, the family. So we went to church with them. The pastor is a man named Doug, wonderful pastor. If you ever have a chance to visit a church in Seattle, then I recommend Bethany Pres. Anyway, he happened to be preaching that very Sunday on the atonement. And he talked about all the ways in which in church history people have tried to figure out this moment, this atoning work of Christ. And he said a very interesting thing in the sermon. He said, no theory of the atonement is adequate. Some are helpful. But that's a good insight. Some theories of the atonement are positively misleading and take us to very, inappropriate places in our understanding. But it has been part of the church's grasp of things that when Jesus was facing this moment, it was a moment in which he became this man who was the most attractive, glorious, winsome, good person. He became, at that moment, what Paul calls sin. He became a curse. In a word, he became the ugliest thing that had ever existed. Because at that point, he became all of what is ugly in us and stood in the place where the response of God's justice to the ugliness of our sin had to be displayed. Jesus, of course, was none of those things in himself. He became all of those things for us. And so we have this thought that runs through the Scripture that he stepped into our shoes, he substituted himself into that which we deserve. The most famous text in the Old Testament, I imagine, is found in Isaiah 53. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. We thought he was stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. We thought God was punishing him. No. He was wounded for our he was punishing us through him. He was pouring out his wrath against me in Christ. That's what's astonishing about this. He was wounded for our transgression and bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, so that by his stripes we are healed. We went away astray like sheep. We all turned to our own way, wandering off the path, and the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. Something of that has to be in the explanation in our minds of what Jesus anticipates here. I cannot improve, and I deeply appreciate Dr. Jim Edwards, of course well known to this church, and his insight in describing this from his commentary. So I just pass this on to you because I was so deeply helped by it myself. It's one thing, he says, fearful as it is to answer for our own sins before a holy and almighty God. Who can imagine what it would be like to stand before God to answer for every sin and crime and act of malice and injury and cowardice and evil in the world? In acquiescing to the Father's will of bearing the sin of many, interceding for transgressors, Isaiah 53, Jesus necessarily experiences an abandonment and darkness of cosmic proportions. The worst prospect of becoming the sin bearer for humanity is that it spells complete alienation from God, an alienation that will shortly echo above the desolate landscape of Calvary, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So Jesus appeals to these who are his closest associates to stay here and watch, asking for support, knowing, of course, there would be none, because, in fact, it was his path alone. He went a little further, fell on the ground, prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. Luke tells us it was about a stone's throw. He prayed that the hour would pass. We have two vivid images of judgment in this text, an hour and a cup. You know from your Old Testament reading, both are used in connection with the notion of judgment. Isaiah 51, "Stand up, O Jerusalem, you have drunk at the hand of the Lord the cup of his fury." You've drunk the dregs of the cup. It's a common motif, the hour, the cup of judgment. But now Jesus is asking that this cup of judgment, if it were, as it were, would pass from him. "Abba, Father," he says, "all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will." I appreciated Betsy's sermon last Sunday. I assume we all heard it, in which she was describing for us the opening line of the Lord's Prayer, "Our Father who art in heaven," and pointing out what is very good to point out. We have no right to call God our Father. In and of ourselves, we have no possible right at all to make that audacious claim, except that we have an elder brother and we have been adopted into a family, and by that right alone, we have this unbelievable privilege of calling God Father. But if we have it even more, of course, Christ can call God Father, and does so here in the most endearing and intimate terms, Abba, Daddy, Father. That is unprecedented, unheard of, and would have been taken basically as blasphemous in the ancient Jewish world to address God in those terms. And yet here Jesus is in this moment of crisis, and that's exactly what he says. It sounds a little bit like what we might have expected Isaac to say as he looked at a knife in the hand of his father Abraham there on Mount Moriah, about to offer his son as a sacrifice, the submission to the will of the Father. And then Jesus says this very interesting, and it's been quite a controversial statement down through church history: "All things are possible for you." I've heard people, I've actually had conversations with people, maybe you have too, who've asked this question: why couldn't God just forgive? I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, God can do anything, can he? Why can't he just wave his hand and say, "Oh, fine, I know you guys messed up, but hey, you're forgiven"? Couldn't God do that? God, all things are possible for you. There was a raging debate in the Middle Ages on that very point between two schools of thought. One school of thought were called the realists, and one was called the nominalists. The realists said God is sub lego. God is under law, bound himself by a standard that he could not escape, and thus, in a sense, there's a limit to that statement, "all things are possible for you." The other, the nominalists, said, well, God is ex lex. He's outside of law, fundamentally lawless. Anything God does is right just because God does it. And these two shot back and forth for the better part of a couple of centuries, trying to unravel the statement, "all things are possible for you." When the Reformers confronted the problem, they opted for a third alternative. It's fun to say, sibi ipsi lex. God is a law to himself. God is not under law, otherwise there'd be something greater than God in the world. God is not outside of law, lawless, but God is a law. He is bound by his own holy integrity. He's bound by the quality of his own character. And part of that character, part of the holiness of God, is that he must be just, which means if there's even the slightest infraction of his righteous standard anywhere in the universe, God cannot ultimately just ignore it. His justice requires that it be disposed of in a just way, that justice be protected. If God does not maintain his justice, then in a sense he doesn't maintain his deity. It is at the core of what he is. Well, we have been the perpetrators of colossal infractions of the righteousness of God. And so the question is, how can God both forgive us, say you're forgiven, and at the same time not breach his own integrity in the process of doing so? And Psalm says, God was under no necessity to provide redemption, but if he did, it demanded nothing less than the atonement offered by the God-man. Jesus could have walked away. It was in fact possible for him to say, enough of this, I'm going home. It would have been possible for him to do that, but it then would have been impossible for us to have salvation. We would have been lost eternally and hopelessly had he not gone through this. And so the very act of the Father and the very act of the Son in this moment of horrific judgment was driven more deeply by God's love. How else can we possibly understand it? So Jesus ultimately surrenders into the Father's will, embodying the third petition of the Lord's Prayer. All right, I'm going to quickly wrap up these last two short paragraphs. Then he came and found them sleeping. This is the part we understand a little better, you see. This is the part I readily identify with. Simon, are you sleeping? Couldn't you watch for an hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit is willing. That spirit of yours was very willing, but the flesh is so weak. There's a great lesson here. The disciples were sleeping because, in a sense, we all were sleeping. When Christ did his work for us, we were oblivious. Paul says in Romans chapter 5, while we were dead, while we were hostile, while we were enemies, while we were indisposed, while we were doing everything we could to escape from the love of God, his love did something for us. And the disciples more or less paint the picture for us of the recipients of love who are oblivious to it at the moment it's happening. Simon, are you sleeping? The same Peter who had been protesting his courage a moment ago now becomes Simon. Couldn't you watch? Remain awake to circumstances and opportunity. I think Peter had this moment in mind when he wrote in the first chapter of his first epistle these words, therefore prepare your minds for action, be self-controlled, set your hope fully on the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed. He had played the other side of that proposition, and now is giving us warning to be aware of it. The spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. It's interesting, Jesus calls him Simon, kind of standing for the flesh. Peter, standing for the Spirit. Which one am I, The flesh hearkens to what I used to be. The Spirit inclines to what I am going to be. I'm in a conflict between my history and my destiny. Part of me wants to drag me back, but the Spirit wants to pull me forward. We're called to invest in the Spirit. Sow to the Spirit, Paul says. Don't sow to the flesh. And we will increasingly find that through God's Spirit, our spirit is strengthened. But at this point, it was a losing proposition, at least for these guys at that time. And the final short paragraph. Again, he went away and prayed, spoke the same words. And when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy and they didn't know what to answer him. Then he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? It's enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. In the book of Genesis, chapter 15, Abraham sleeps through a covenant-cutting ceremony. It's a remarkable example of the very thing we're seeing here. God is making rich promises to Abraham, and he's doing nothing to help out, you see. And in a sense, the disciples remind us of something of that. They didn't know how to answer. We don't know how to answer. We all have no excuse when we stand before God. This hour has come, and it brings us to the moment when Jesus seems the most forsaken, and it's at that moment that he carries out God's deepest purpose. All right, well, quickly, Sunday school lesson. Remember Peter's words, "Even if all stumble, I will not." Peter hadn't had a chance to read Paul's warning because it hadn't been written yet. 1 Corinthians 10, "Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall." That's a good verse to just recycle about 50 times a day. Jesus says, "Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation." Temptation takes us down a little path, you know how it works. And in temptation, there is a line that you cross that is kind of a point of no return. And our job is to stay way clear of that line. James says in chapter 1, "Each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. And when desire has conceived," we cross that line, "it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." And finally, Jesus says the hour has come. I appreciated one commentator who said, for that moment, it came for Jesus when the quiet serenity of the Garden of Gethsemane was disrupted by guys with clubs and torches and Judas leading the pack and so on. And that brought the hour of action. The hour has come. He was pointing out that all of us have a moment when the hour comes in some sense or other. He says, quote, "Such an hour does come. It came with the matter of human slavery to Wilberforce, Clarkson, Zachary, McElroy, who were champions of the abolition movement, especially in England, who said, 'We've discussed long enough. Rise, let's be going.' It came with the matter of evangelizing the world with Carey and Judson and Morrison. Such an hour must come sooner or later to every human heart. There is a time of preparation, there's a time of action. We see both in the lesson of Jesus in this remarkable text."